This is episode 110 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at castycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Catherine James, curator at the Beinecke Library and author of English Paleography and Manuscript Culture, 1500 to 1800. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
At the very end of the Pastons' careers, if you like, in 1735, the final house of the Pastons was falling down, and a man from Norfolk, what we call an antiquarian, a man greatly interested in documents, found himself looking through the ruins of the house and discovered the 2 sacks containing the 1,000 Paston Letters.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
The Paston Letters are a collection of over 1,000 pieces of correspondence between 1422 and 1509, which, while never intended to last into the modern era, have been preserved throughout centuries for the unique light they shed on the everyday events in 15th century England. John Paston was a lawyer in England, and while the letters sometimes represent the communication of John Paston to members of the aristocracy, most of the letters are written by his wife, Margaret, who is writing to her husband at work in London. Replete with illustrations as well as words, the letters detail mundane items like shopping lists and recipes, provide examples of medieval colloquial expressions, and perhaps the most powerful content found in the Paston Letters is their timeline of how the War of the Roses unfolded. During the late 15th century, England was effectively lawless, while the king was paralyzed due to his surrounding nobles stifling the enforcement of law. The Paston Letters show that the government of England was hugely disorganized, with even the succession of the crown coming under contestation. This overarching discontent led to the rising of Jack Cade and outlines the rise of the War of the Roses. Since Shakespeare's history plays also detail the rise of the War of the Roses, including characters like Jack Cade and the character of Falstaff, whom some scholars believe was based on a relative to the Pastons named John Fastolf, there is often the suggestion that Shakespeare used the Paston Letters as a source for his plays. Is it true, though? Our guest this week, Rob Nee from the Paston Heritage Society, is here to separate legend from fact as we explore the Paston Letters and their role in the life of William Shakespeare. After a career in education and research, Rob Nee has subsequently engaged in the study of local history. A large production of his work relates to researching the story of the Paston family of Norfolk. Rob is the chair of the Paston Heritage Society and co-leader of Paston Footprints, a large heritage project aimed at bringing the Paston history to a wider audience. Rob also gives in-role costume performances on the leading Paston characters, and you can see a picture of him playing the role of John Paston himself in today's show notes. Hello, Rob. Welcome to the show.
Hi, good to see you.
Are all of the letters in the Paston Letters collection written by the same person?
No, they're not. They're written by many different people, and many of them are scribed by servants or members of the household. Scribing was considered a pretty menial task, although sometimes everybody had to muck in and help. But Margaret Paston wrote most of the letters. Some were written by her husband and her sons. Most of them were scribed by members of her household.
The Paston Letters were written on paper as opposed to parchment, and that tells us something about the intention of the letters. Rob, why does the Paston Letters being written on paper indicate that they were never intended to be kept for posterity?
Well, that's a slightly complicated one. Most of the writing of important documents was done on parchment. Parchment was very expensive and not the easiest way of communicating. So in the 15th century, paper from Europe was imported into England, and that was preferred because it was a much easier material to use and much cheaper. We didn't start making paper in this country until the end of the 15th century, so all the paper had to be imported. But that was easy for the Pastons because they were busy doing trade with all the European countries anyway. But ironically, the paper that was made in those days was incredibly durable. It was made from rags and pressed and dried. And so it was, in fact, a material that was going to last almost as long as parchment, which is one of the reasons why the letters survive so beautifully today. Were they intended to be kept? Well, the letters were very private. The family were lawyers and had a habit of keeping things safe, especially when there might be sensitive material contained in them. So most of the letters were kept, which is why they all ended up in one giant collection and formed such a coherent package.
Since the letters were never intended to be preserved for a long time, how is it that we still have this massive collection of letters? I know you said that they kept them and stored them, but was it common for a family to preserve their private correspondence this way? And if so, why don't we have more collections of letters from similar families in this time period?
It probably was quite common for families to keep their letters. There weren't that many families, as far as we know, were in a position to write many letters, and there are 2 or 3 other collections that do survive from that time, the Stonor letters in particular. But the Pastons are by easily the largest and most significant collection. They survived because at the very end of the Pastons' careers, if you like, in 1735, the final house of the Pastons was falling down. And a man from Norfolk, what we call an antiquarian, a man greatly interested in documents, found himself looking through the ruins of the house and discovered the 2 sacks containing the 1,000 Paston letters. Now, that was entirely fortunate that they were there and had been left there because everything else on the estate at Oxnead had been picked dry by everybody else in the neighbourhood. But the letters survived, and he was the perfect man to find them because he was extremely keen on looking at them, documenting them and selling them. And there became another stream of interesting activity that took place where the letters passed from hand to hand until somebody saw their great worth and decided to print them and publish them. And they've been in publication ever since. So it was a bit of an accident, if you like, that they did survive, but it's a tribute to the family that they kept them so carefully and to the people who came after them, who discovered them and then decided to look after them and bring them to publication.
Generally, when we think about 15th to 16th century society, we assume that most people were illiterate, and that conflicts with this large collection of letters from this time period. And I want to ask you, Rob, to talk to us about whether or not there was a piece of society during this time period that was not only literate, but proliferously involved in written communication.
Yes, there were the percentage of the society that could be described as literate wasn't huge. It might have been around 5%. But that 5% were highly educated, both men and women. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge were in full swing in those days. Pastons were also educated at the Inns of Court in London, where the lawyers were trained. We also had the establishment in many households of a chaplaincy, and of course people from the church were invariably very well educated and therefore would teach the children in the household. So of that 5%, they were very competent at writing. That percentage was to grow as the decades passed. And obviously you get to the time of Shakespeare when his father was a glover living in Stratford. And of course, that family clearly grew up with a capacity, to put it mildly, to write well.
A little bit.
Yes. So you go from that, and you've got it's the church, really. It's the devotional side. It's the desire to read prayer books that were given to children on their baptism. And also in the case of the Pastons, it was the rising social mobility and travelling, which necessitated the writing of these letters. So there were some powerful drivers around at the time that actually were encouraging the literacy levels to go up quite steeply.
As you say, there are 1,000 of these letters to go through, but one type of content contained in the collection are quite relatably, shopping lists. What were people shopping for in the 16th century? And when we say that there were shopping lists, is this like a grocery list that you would take to market for remembering what to buy?
No, not quite. Many of the shopping lists originated from the fact that usually the husband of the household would be in London. And the wives had an eye for what might have been purchased in London, so would not miss an opportunity to remind their husbands that when they were in London, they should not forget to buy things for them. Although the Pastons were slightly different, not only because we've got a remarkable number of the letters, but we've also got some remarkable shopping lists. Perhaps the most famous letter was written by Margaret Paston when she was being besieged in her castle in North Norfolk. And she wrote to her husband, and in the same letter she asks him for pole axes, leather jackets, crossbows and crossbow bolts, but doesn't miss the opportunity in this desperate letter to add at the end she also needs almonds, sugar and cloth for her children's clothes.
Well, sure. When you're fighting an army, you've got to fix them dessert.
That tells you quite a lot about Margaret. Other letters are very interesting. During the time of the plague, which came and went on several occasions in the 15th and 16th centuries, treacle was believed to be able to ward off the plague. So quite a number of the letters are asking for pots of Genoan treacle to be brought home from London. And then there's always the request for clothing. And then later on, when the boys of the family start to grow up, there's a request for goshawks and new suits of armour. So not really a typical shopping list, but it gives you an idea of the opportunities they had if somebody was in London to ask them to bring something you could only get in London back to Norfolk.
Now, on these shopping lists, it wasn't always pole axes and almonds and sugar or even suits of armor, because in 2019, the BBC reported that the Paston Letters should have been destroyed because of their subversive content. To me, that seemed like a strong accusation for a packet of letters containing shopping items. So what else is inside these letters that should be considered subversive?
Well, it's slightly heavy-handed comment in a way, because the letters weren't riddled with treasonous comments. But in the nature of their correspondence, this family was struggling to make its way in society. And occasionally they had to say things and pass on intelligence. And they were private letters. So, for example, when they were being attacked again in Norfolk by, on this occasion, the Duke of Suffolk, John Paston wrote from London to his wife to say, "The man's ancestry does not support his right to this property any more than ours does," which I guess, if he'd fallen into the wrong hands, could have been slightly embarrassing. Equally embarrassing were some of the arrangements that were being made for marriages within the family. The boys wrote to each other about how to court a woman and other matters. There was also a letter which described how Agnes, the grandmother of the family, used to beat her daughter because she refused to marry somebody. So all slightly embarrassing, potentially. And then you have trade secrets. The Pastons were very astute business people, knew how to make a few pounds out of selling barley in a certain way, so that was in there. But probably the most important background to this period was it was the Wars of the Roses, and it was a civil war. And so you were on one side or the other. So you wanted your letters to be very carefully looked after in case it got into the wrong hands. So that's really perhaps the background to these letters, and probably why the collection was kept together so neatly and carefully, because there was that risk. And the Pastons navigated their way very skillfully between the houses of York and the houses of Lancaster to make sure that the war didn't interfere with their social progress.
I can only imagine Shakespeare would be appreciative or even admiring of this balance between the houses of York and Lancaster, as we see Shakespeare do something similar in his plays. Do you think it's possible Shakespeare could have used the Paston Letters as a source to inform his history of England and the rise of the War of the Roses?
Probably not, because the letters don't become well known or famous until several hundred years after Shakespeare in the 18th century. So he probably wouldn't have known them as a source. But if you flip the thing, what you've got there in the Paston Letters is a remarkable supplementary source for the understanding of Shakespeare's plays of the Wars of the Roses. because the Paston Letters chart the whole period very detailed way from the point of view of a normal family in England. So if you want to understand Shakespeare's plays in greater detail from this period, the history plays, the Paston Letters are very good places to look. For example, the Wars of the Roses are precipitated Henry VI when he becomes deranged or mad or mentally ill or whatever. Now, there are descriptions of the king in the Paston Letters from their friends describing how the king came to be like this, and also when he emerged from this state to cause yet another twist in history. You've also got accounts of the Battle of Towton and Barnet, Bosworth and Stoke. You've got portraits of the kings of the time, the magnates who were at play. You've also got the Paston's own history. Young John Paston, III as we call him, a younger one, was assigned to the Duke of Norfolk's household, and he goes on manoeuvres with the Duke of Norfolk in England. You've got a summons by the Duke of Norfolk for John Paston to join him at the Battle of Bosworth, and so on. So what you have in the Paston Letters is a remarkably detailed background to the Wars of the Roses, which I would recommend to anybody who wants to get a slightly better feel for England at the time of Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare was obviously writing about the Wars of the Roses from a headline point of view to portray his hollow crown, his kings and their doings. But the Pastons weren't far behind. They were at the court of the king. So a lot of the letters give you some very interesting extra detail about what was going on, some of the machinations that were going on behind the scenes as people jockeyed for position in their alliances and their traitorships, if you like.
Now, we will link to a place where you can read the Paston Letters and dive into this as a supplement to your study of Shakespeare in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you check there for those. Speaking of the overlap between real life and history, Rob, there was a real life man named John Fastolf, related to John Paston and owner at the Boar's Head Inn in Southwark. Another Boar's Head Inn in Eastcheap is the supposed meeting place of the fictional Sir John Falstaff, Prince Hal, and other characters in Shakespeare's Henriade plays. Some scholars have used the similarities between John Fastolf and John Falstaff, as well as the use of the Boar's Head Inn by name in Shakespeare's plays, to suggest there's a relationship between Shakespeare's character and the real-life man named John Fastolf. Do the Paston Letters shed any light on this idea, Rob? Could Shakespeare have based Falstaff on John Paston's cousin?
Well, it's a bit of a travesty, to be honest with you. Shakespeare doesn't behave particularly well in this occasion because his original character in the plays was not Falstaff. It was a man called Sir John Oldcastle. Now, when the Oldcastle family began to realise that the leader of their family was portrayed by Shakespeare in less than a good light, and when we realised that one of Shakespeare's patrons was also related to Oldcastle, a patron, William Brooke, who was patron of the Lord Chamberlain's men, the Oldcastle family complained to Shakespeare and said this wasn't on. So Shakespeare needed another character in which to fulfil this role in his plays of a slightly drunken, disappointing, awkward man who has quite an important part to play, as we know. He then lighted on the idea of Sir John Fastolf. Now, Fastolf is well over a century before Shakespeare's writing his plays, a man long dead and couldn't complain. He chooses Fastolf and uses him to fulfill this role. Now, Fastolf actually was a very, very important knight, a man of great honour, extremely astute, highly successful soldier, and a man who has amassed a fortune. It is a travesty, and many people ask me, is the Fastolf in the Paston Letters the same as Falstaff in Shakespeare's plays? And the answer is no. The name's similar, but Shakespeare was looking for another person to put into that role, and he chose Fastolf. There is a slight link, I guess, that Fastolf, during the wars in France, is reputed to have been in a battle and chose to retreat. And the saying, he who lives to fight a day runs away and fights another day. And Falstaff was chastised by people at the time for retreating because they thought it was not honourable. Falstaff was just being very prudent about his troops. But that was a stain that Falstaff had to shake off for some time. So it may be that Shakespeare thought, well, I've got a man with a potential flaw in his character who's so long gone that nobody's going to complain. I can use him as my character. If I may go on, though, that we're beginning to revise our history. On Netflix recently, there was a very good reinterpretation of Henry V called The King. In that film, they put Falstaff into a leading role. He is not a buffoon, but he's a military advisor to Henry V and plays a major part in his success. So perhaps we're now beginning to get a slight revision, and good old Falstaff is getting the kind of reputation he deserves and not the drunken oaf that Shakespeare shows him to be.
Well, so there's a great deal of drama between these two men in real life as well as in posterity. But was John Paston brought under a threat of violence as a result of John Fastolf's will?
He most certainly was. He worked for John Fastolf, and then he inherited all of Fastolf's colossal wealth, his castle at Caister, his magnificent house in London, close to Eastcheap and the Boar's Head, on the River Thames. Paston inherits all of this in somewhat controversial circumstances, those being that when Falstaff died, Paston was the only person in the room, and he emerged from the death chamber to explain to the awaiting family that Sir John had left everything to him. So you can imagine that went down extremely badly amongst Falstaff's family. It also went down extremely badly amongst the powerful magnates in East Anglia because Caister Castle was a state-of-the-art castle which Falstaff had built from the best European designs, and everybody else wanted it. So the Pastons, who had not yet proved themselves to be gentry, were certainly not going to be allowed to keep any of the wealth or the land or the castle, and so they endured 10 to 15 years of serious harassment and problems.
And that's where all of the besiegement comes from in Margaret's letters, was them trying to defend these locations?
They were besieged at Caister Castle and had to surrender after 6 weeks. They did finally get the castle back, and they did keep some of Fastolf's land, but what they really wanted more than anything else was the status of the castle and the status of the inheritance and the influence and power that eventually bought them, which it did. So it was a tough time for them, and John Paston had a very difficult time, and it wore him down to an early death, in all probability. But in the end, his sons were able to benefit, and the family went on from that moment and didn't look back.
John Paston is famous today for these letters, as they offer a unique and really key insight into what life was like in 16th century England. But was the actual John Paston famous in his own lifetime, or did he spend his life chasing this kind of influence and power?
I think he began to be noticed at the court of the kings because he was at loggerheads with two of the most powerful men in England, the Duke of Suffolk and the Duke of Norfolk. Both those dukes were a thorn in the side of the kings of England because they were very powerful men and always had been. John Paston was causing them a few problems with his acquisitions. So the Duke of Norfolk is attacking him at Caister Castle. The Duke of Suffolk is attacking him at Helston Manor and at Gresham Castle. And we get the feeling that the kings at the time were quite happy for both these dukes to be somewhat held up in matters by John Paston. We also know that the king summons John Paston because John Paston refuses to accept a knighthood. Part of the plan to raise the Pastons to counterbalance these powerful dukes in East Anglia was that John Paston would become knighted and would begin to gather his own retinue and gain his power. But John Paston was a shrewd man and didn't want to be waylaid by the responsibilities of the knighthood and the involvement in the politics that would have led. So he refused it. Such a refusal was a dangerous thing to do. His friends pleaded with him not to do this, but in the end, he stuck to his guns, and he was summoned by the king to answer for this and was imprisoned. So he clearly had come to the notice of the king, He'd also come to the notice of the king because he put his eldest son into the king's court, young John. And young John was an exceedingly good jouster and warrior, and he jousted with the king at Eltham Castle, and we have accounts of that in the letters. So he was probably on good terms with the king as well. So the Pastons were beginning to get known at the court, and so their reputation was growing. And it wasn't long after, certainly at the arrival of the Tudors, that they became very much part of the higher echelon of society. So I suspect John Paston was a man that people had noticed, and his name would have been on people's lips as somebody who was going somewhere. And of course, the reputation of the family had come from very low. They were ploughmen in Norfolk. They'd risen from that through their legal training. So it was quite an interesting story, I suspect, for many people, this Paston and his family.
Their story is certainly a fascinating one, and one I know we would love to explore further. In addition to reading the actual letters themselves, what are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend we use to learn more about the Pastons and these letters?
Well, one of the most interesting books that have emerged in recent years was by Helen Castor. She is a Cambridge academic who wrote an excellent book called Blood and Roses, which is an account of the Wars of the Roses from the point of view of the Pastons. And it's a wonderfully researched, very detailed, and extremely exciting book for a historically factual book that is as good as a thriller almost. So I would always recommend that book to anybody who wants to know more about the Pastons or the Wars of the Roses. We also have a book by Roger Virgo, which is a very interesting explanation of the Pastons and their time in England, with lots of interesting background information about travelling and letter writing and education and the role of women. I would also recommend our own resources that we're developing with the help of a grant from the Lottery Project. And we have a website, which I believe will be published in your details, which is gathering information and imagery and stories, which is also somewhere I would recommend people to visit if they want to know more about the Pastons.
You're welcome to tell us the actual URL. Is it something that we can say? Is it live and functional, or should we put it in the show notes?
It's live and functional, and it's quite simply www.thisispaston.co.uk.
Excellent. Well, definitely go there to learn more. And we will, as you say, link to this in the show notes for today's episode. Rob, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, I've just finished for the second time a book by a man called Brian Keenan called An Evil Cradling. And I decided to read it because in this time of lockdown, this is a story of Brian Keenan, who's an Irishman, along with an Englishman and 2 or 3 Americans who were held hostage in Beirut for 5 years. 5 years in a small cell. And I've been thinking, and I've been reinforced in my view, that they found ways to survive for 5 years in a 5-foot by 5-foot cell, in terrible threats of violence and the unknowing. And that has proved to be an inspiration for me. And I would recommend it to anybody else. If we find ourselves frustrated by being restricted in our liberty, these men had it really bad. But they survived and they triumphed.
Well, it's certainly a very timely choice. Absolutely. Thank you for that. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I mentioned our website and our project. Since the virus, of course, everybody in the world wants to go online to find things to do, to learn and to read about. So we are making our project one that is completely focused to the website for education, for home educators, for researchers, for people who are interested in Shakespeare, in the Middle Ages, a whole range of historical interests. So this website is our focus at the moment, and we are putting all the Paston letters on there with footnotes and maps and background information, 3D imagery of some of the Paston houses that they had at the time, educational resources, and so on. So that is what I'm very busy doing, and I don't get a moment's piece from my man in charge of the website, who sends me something to do every day.
I've just jumped over there on my internet browser right now just to take a quick glance, and it's fascinating. There is absolutely just tons of information there. We will definitely be linking to this in the show notes for today's episode. Thank you again, Rob, for being here and taking us on this trip into the Paston Letters and helping us get to know this family. This has been a delightful conversation.
Thank you very much indeed.
Find links to where you can read the Paston Letters for yourself, explore the history of John Fastolf and John Falstaff in Shakespeare's plays, as well as the excellent resources Rob mentions today to learn more about the Paston family themselves, all packed into the show notes at CassidyCash.com/episode 110. That's CassidyCash.com/EP110. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right, That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available, and not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.